We'd like to discuss the concept of the Mashiach through Jewish history, and today we're going to discuss something very, very important, and we're going to try to get a deep understanding of some of the very important events that happened quite a while ago, and there's a lot of mystery associated with this, and we're going to learn some very, very interesting concepts in Jewish history. First of all, I'd like to talk about a man, Yeravam ben Nevat, who was one of the kings of Israel, and some of the events that transpired with him that still affect us today, very, very critically. We have once before discussed this to some extent, and I'd just like to again go over this, because he plays such a critical role with the Messianic prophecies. He is chiefly responsible for certain events that will happen to the Jews in the future, but which apparently may have been corrected, and I'll explain that in a second. Yeravam ben Nevat was one of the kings of Israel, and after King David HaMelech, he had a son, Shlomo HaMelech, and Shlomo HaMelech had a son, Yeravam, and Yeravam was the king of the tribe of Judah. And at that time, the Bunisham decided to divide the Jews into two different groups. He divided the Jews into the Shevet called Yehuda, or the tribe of Judah, and the king of Judah was Yeravam, and the other 10 tribes in Israel were ruled by a man, Yeravam ben Nevat. And this was at God's command. This was not a coup d'etat, this was not some kind of an aggressive action. This was by the will of God, and there's a very deep mystery in terms of that the Bunisham wanted two kings over Israel, and that had to do with the fact that the Jews, to some degree, had fallen. So there would be two kings over Israel. One king was to rule over the 10 tribes, and that was Yeravam ben Nevat, and the other would be over the tribe of Yehuda, and that was Yeravam. So, this is essentially what occurred historically, but Yeravam ben Nevat was told to become king of the 10 tribes, and he was told to become king from the 10 tribes by a very important biblical personality, Achia Hashiloni. A very interesting person, Achia the Shilonite, Hashiloni. And Achia Hashiloni was the teacher of Eliyahu Hanavi. He was the Rebbe of Eliyahu Hanavi. Number one. Number two, Achia Shiloni also was a very old man. He was born at the time that the Jews were in Egypt, and he was still alive at that point. So you're talking about several hundred years. And Achia Shiloni was an extraordinary individual. And he told Yeravam ben Nevat that the Bunisham had told him that he would become the king of the 10 tribes. Now, what does this mean? What it means is the following. There are two different individuals who are capable of becoming the king of Israel, who have some ability to become a king. And both of these individuals are connected to the concept of Mashiach. One is the concept of Mashiach ben David, and that's the Davidic king. That's the one who comes from David HaMelech. And the other is the Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben Yosef is considered a king, a melech. Even though God promised the kingship to David HaMelech, nevertheless, because of Yosef, you see, and what he went through in Egypt, in Ephraim, he had the capacity to become a king. So when the Bunisham divided the tribes of Israel and gave each one a king, essentially what was done is that Yeravam, who was the king of Judah, had the power of the Mashiach ben David, and Yeravam ben Nevat, who was the king of the 10 tribes, had the power of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Number one. The second important thing is that at that point in time, the Jews were very, very close to the actual coming of the Mashiach itself. They were extraordinarily close. In fact, they were so close that Yeravam ben Nevat, who was the Mashiach ben Yosef, began to become connected to the actual messianic soul called the Melech HaMashiach, or the Yechida. As we've said before, if you remember, what makes a Mashiach, what makes a before Mashiach, and what makes it after Mashiach? What makes it is a soul called the Yechida. The Yechida is a certain type of soul, but it's the highest soul of all, and it has never really descended. Adam Rishon, had he not done the sin, should have taken this neshama onto himself. That neshama called the Yechida would have become connected to his neshama, and as it became connected, the two neshamas would have connected with each other, so that the Yechida, which is the higher neshama, would have been like a crown to the base neshama. At that point, when that occurs, then the individual who experiences that connection becomes the Mashiach. That's what it takes. In every generation, there is an individual who has the ability, or a base neshama, who can receive this Yechida. Nobody has ever received it yet, or else there would be a Mashiach. That's what's holding it back. That Yechida has never descended. It was supposed to come down on Adam, but it never did. So Adam never became Mashiach. And that neshama now still awaits in Shemayim, in the heavens somewhere, in a place called Cain Sipor, or the bird's nest. It is a mystical place which contains this Yechida. And every once in a while the Yechida kind of begins to arouse itself in some way to come down. But it cannot come down because the time has not come. When the time does come, that neshama begins to descend. And then as it descends fully and comes onto the neshama of the person who is Mashiach, suddenly his mind opens up and he sees things from one end of the world to the other. And that person becomes totally imbued with the full power of the Mashiach. That's why the Yechida is also called the Melech HaMashiach. Melech HaMashiach, or the King Mashiach. That neshama is the crown, and it's called the Melech HaMashiach. Whenever you see in the Talmud or in the Medrash, and it refers to the Melech HaMashiach, it doesn't mean the person who's living, or the base neshama, because no one has ever been a Mashiach yet. It means the crown soul, and that's called the Melech HaMashiach, or the Messianic King. Okay, now that neshama descends on two people, and two people are connected to it and share it. And one person is the Mashiach ben David, and the other is Mashiach ben Yosef. These are two individuals who have the soul capable of connecting to this crown called Yechida. They connect to it together, so in some mysterious way they share that crown. And when that happens, both of them are empowered with the full credentials of becoming a Mashiach. Okay. This is the basic understanding of what it is. This is what makes a Mashiach, or what doesn't make a Mashiach. It's the descent of that neshama. Now, Yeravam ben Nevat was so close to becoming Mashiach that Yechida began to descend. That's how close and how great Yeravam ben Nevat was. But what happened? A very strange incident happened, that in certain circumstances, the Jews, for example, in the reading of the Torah, at certain times when the Jews get together in the Beit HaMikdash, then the king, the Davidic king, who is Yeravam, begins to read certain things or attend to certain matters. And all the Jews must rise to honor the Davidic king, or the king of the tribe of Judah. He's called the Davidic king, you see. The other king, who is Yeravam, is the king of the 10 tribes, and sometimes he's called the king of Ephraim. That's the main thing of those 10 tribes. Now the Davidic king takes precedence over the king of the 10 tribes, so that Yeravam ben Nevat had to stand up for Rechavam. And that he couldn't take. Apparently Yeravam ben Nevat was a very arrogant man also. Or rather, the Yetzer Hara came to him and attempted to make him jealous, so that he wouldn't stand for being number 2 man in the organization. So because of that, he conspired to become the number 1 man in the organization, and he decided to take the 10 tribes away and he began to initiate certain types of avodah zarah, certain types of idol worship. And what he did was, he began to establish the worship of calves all over Israel in the 10 tribes. They were called the Egel or the Agolim. And in different locations, he set up a calf and made that as a center of worship, so that the Jews who lived in the 10 tribes would no longer go down to Yerushalayim into the Beit HaMikdash itself. Rather, they start to worship these calves. Now, let's just understand this, and it's a very deep matter. What does this mean? Why would a Jew want to worship a calf and not go down to the Beit HaMikdash? What kind of insanity is that? Okay, it's not an insanity. Not at all. We today cannot understand what Yeravam did, because to us it looks ridiculous. What do you mean, he set up a calf and he says go worship the calf? But remember, who else worshipped the calf? The Jews when they left Egypt. Were they stupid? What were they doing? The answer is the calf is a very mysterious thing. The calf is the symbol of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And that's what it says. When Moshe gives the bracha at the end to the tribe of Yosef, Moshe says, B'chol shoro hodalo, v'kanu ve'im kanov. He says that Yosef is like the firstborn of an ox, of a shore. So the shore and the egel, which is a calf of a ox, is really the symbol of Yosef. It's a symbol of the power of Yosef. And as I've explained once a long time ago, when the Jews were in the desert, and they left Egypt, and Moshe went up for 40 days, and he failed to return on the 40th day, they miscalculated. They thought that Moshe Rabbeinu was going to come down the 40th day. He didn't, because he was supposed to come down the 41st day. So what happened was, the Sultan showed a vision to all the Jews through prophecy, and they all saw Moshe Rabbeinu resting on a bier. He was dead. The Sultan conjured up an image of Moshe being dead, so they all believed that Moshe had died. And what they wanted to do was to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, how do you replace Moshe Rabbeinu? How do you do that? The answer is, you can't replace Moshe, but you can replace his power. What was the power of Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu was a Mashiach ben Yosef. He was a Mashiach ben Yosef. And they knew how to replace the power of a Mashiach ben Yosef. And the way they would do it is to construct an image of a calf. And through certain very deep things, Kabbalistic things which we no longer know, they can literally empower that object, and they can draw down from the Shemayim all the spiritual powers which are associated with Mashiach ben Yosef, right onto this object, this calf. And once they do that, they then can partake of that power and usurp the power itself. We don't know how that's done, because that practice no longer exists. Just like the whole practice of idol worship no longer exists. They had a much greater mind at those times, and essentially they were much closer to spiritual forces. But they know how to do it. Now Yeravam, who was the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, had that power, and he knew exactly how to usurp the power of the Beit HaMikdash and force a certain aspect of the Shekhinah, a certain aspect of it, to come down on the calf, so that the calf can compete with the Beit HaMikdash itself. So this was no small thing that he was doing. Now why did he want to do that? He wanted to do it because he couldn't stand being number two. He couldn't stand for Mashiach ben David to exist that would be higher than him. So in that case, the Jews were very close to the Messianic period. They were very close again. And the Sultan obviously went up to the Baruch Shalom and said, look, I see that the Jews are one step away from getting the Mashiach. And I see that Mashiach is Yeravam ben Nevat and Rechavam. That's what I see. But I want the chance to test them out once more. So the Baruch Shalom says, how do you want to test them? So the Sultan says, I can't test them anymore, but there's one way I can test. And this is a very, very deep thing. When the Jews are right at the point when the Mashiach should arrive, you see, and the Jews still are in a position where they must bring the Mashiach by their own efforts, you see. In the end, what's called the case, or the end of time, the Mashiach will come with or without what the Jews do. That's something else. But until that last time is reached, the Jews must do something themselves to bring the Mashiach. Now when the Jews do certain things, and they almost bring the possibility of Mashiach coming, and they're 1 inch away, right? Then the Sultan has the right to say, I want to test him one more time, the last test. The last test. But when the Jews are so close, what can be the last test? That last test always has to do with the Mashiach itself. So that when the Jews left Egypt, and they were by Har Sinai, and they received the Torah, they were not even an inch, they were like a micron away from the Yemot Mashiach. So the Sultan says, I have the ability to test them once more, but I'm going to test them with the very concept of the Mashiach, and I'm going to see if I can seduce them to build their own Mashiach. And that was the whole sin of the golden calf. It was the last test that the Jews would submit to, you see, and what he did was the Sultan created an illusion that Moshe had died, and he wanted to see if the Jews would fall for the trick and build their own calf and draw down the power of Mashiach from Yosef. Now you may say, well, the Jews were seduced, it wasn't their fault, but that's not true, because the Jews should have realized that Moshe wasn't dead. Because they knew that God promised them that the ultimate redemption would come only through Moshe Rabbeinu. So when they saw this vision in front of them, they should have realized that it was some kind of trick of the Sultan. So the entire thing depended on whether they wanted to believe that Moshe died, not as in fact he did. Because they had the ability to refute the vision and to realize it was a test. But what the Sultan wanted to know is whether or not they would prefer to have a Mashiach ben Yosef that they constructed and therefore that they controlled, or a Mashiach ben Yosef who God constructed, Moshe Rabbeinu, and who the Bonishim controlled. So it boils down to the old problem, who is stronger, me or God? That's what it boils down to. But since the Jews were so close to the Mashiach itself, then that test of arrogance had to relate with the very concept of Mashiach itself. It was the same thing with Yeravam ben Nevat. The only last test the last test that the Sultan could do, or the Makasser can do, to make sure that the Jews are worthy of Mashiach, was to test the Jews with the concept of Mashiach. So the first one he went to was the Mashiach himself, Yeravam ben Nevat. And what he tried to do was to make one Mashiach jealous of the other. Now that's a bizarre concept, because if you know anything about the concept of Mashiach, both of them work hand in hand. They work hand in hand. So for one Mashiach to become jealous of the other, because remember, one Mashiach represents the process of Kedusha, and the other represents the process of Tahara. But both of them work hand in hand, and the Pasuk says, there's a very famous Pasuk in Tanakh, where God says, I have taken the tree of Judah, and the tree of Yosef, and I put them together, and they will be as one in my hand. They will be as one in my hand. So what the Bonishim was saying is that the two Mashiach are connected, because they're connected to the Yechida. So they're really two parts of the same thing. They are called spiritual twins, not real twins. But in thing they're considered Ruchni-stika twins, because they're split in a certain sense from almost the same neshama, and they share the same crown. That's why the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David are considered spiritual twins. So therefore, the two of them are allies, not adversaries. But we saw once before when the two Mashiachim became adversaries. Where did we see that? No, well, in a sense, yes. In a sense, there was between Esav and Yaakov, in a certain sense. But there was another time, even more specific. Yehuda and Yosef. Yehuda participated with all the brothers to tell Yosef. So what you had was one Mashiach selling the other. And Yehuda was punished. He was punished because even though Yehuda was the, what? Yehuda. Because even though Yehuda, you have to remember Yehuda, if we remember from last time, Yehuda was the root of the Mashiach ben David. But if you notice, the Mashiach ben David is called the Mashiach ben David. He's not called the Mashiach ben Yehuda. Whereas the Mashiach ben Yosef is called the Mashiach ben Yosef. Right? So the question is, why is the Mashiach ben Yosef called after Yosef, but the Mashiach ben David is called after David, who came from Yehuda, but not Yehuda himself? And the answer is because Yehuda was punished, because he sold Yosef. Since one Mashiach went against another Mashiach, he lost the title to that messianic crown. That's why it's called the Mashiach ben David. Now, just like the Sultan had done that with Yosef and Yehuda, he again reappeared to Yeravam ben Nevat and said, wait a minute, are you going to take that? Are you going to be the number 2 man over here? And Yeravam ben Nevat was seduced to become arrogant. You see. And what he did was he began to develop these calves. So the Bonishim came to him and says, don't do it. Don't do it. Do tshuva. He came to Yeravam and Nevat. He said, I want you to do tshuva. Repent. And if you repent, you and Ben David, the son of David, who was Yeravam, and me will walk in Gan Eden, the three of us together. It means the Shechina, means the two Mashiachin and the Shechina will all dwell on the highest level. So Yeravam said the famous statement, Mi Barosh, who is the head one? Who is first? So the Bonisham says, Ben David. So Yeravam said, if that's the case, I'm not interested. Astounding, isn't it? Astounding. But that's the power of the Yetzer Hara. You see, you must understand, Yeravam was an extraordinary individual. You're talking about a Mashiach. An extraordinary individual. But the problem here is that before the Mashiach comes, the Jews must be worthy of it. So the Sultan has the right to test them out. And right before the Mashiach comes, the last test that he does has to do with the prophet Mashiach itself. So that the Sultan had the ability to go to Yeravam and literally try to seduce them in arrogance. You see. And the last test available was to make one Mashiach jealous of the other. So he fell. Now the question you may ask, wait a minute, just because Yeravam and Nevat was a fool, does that mean that the Jews are no longer worthy of the Mashiach because their Mashiach ben Yosef fell down the stairs? Why should the Jews suffer? The answer is they would not have suffered. They would not. But what happened? Yeravam and Nevat built all these different calves at different locations. And the Jews went along with him. They didn't have to go along with him. So they also were tested. So what basically happened was you had a repetition of the golden calf all over again. That's in essence what was going on. And the Jews fell. And what happened was very, very severe. And the consequences of what they did, we live with today. Why? Because remember, who sinned? Yeravam ben Nevat sinned, Mashiach ben Yosef, and the 10 tribes sinned. When the 10 tribes followed Yeravam ben Nevat, a decree came from heaven, and who knows what that decree was? That the 10 tribes would be conquered by Assyria and would be lost. That's where the 10 tribes were first lost. That's how it started. Because since the 10 tribes followed Yeravam ben Nevat, the Din, or the decree of heaven was that the 10 tribes would be swallowed up in the world, and no one would ever know where they were until the last Mashiach arrives. That was their punishment. Now we all know about the legend of the 10 tribes. And where are these 10 tribes, really? Well, there's different arguments going, and throughout history there have been different kinds of records that indicate some people have been coming back. Like there was a very famous person in the 9th century, in the 10th century, Eldad Hadoni. His name was Eldad Hadoni, or the Danite, who was from the tribe of Dan. And he was claimed to be one of the 10 tribes. And every once in a while somebody would come back from the 10 tribes. You see. Now there seems to be some kind of a controversy of where they are. And some people feel that the 10 tribes are in some special location, which has never been discovered, and they're separated by a river called the Sambatyon. And that river is a very large river, but it hurls up huge stones, so that nobody can traverse or pass over the river. Except on Shabbos, it's calm. But on Shabbos you can't go by boat. So therefore the 10 tribes are forever captive in this land where they are. That's one theory what it is. It's a nice thing. I have no idea its veracity and so on. I personally feel that maybe another truth here as well. You see. And I believe what happened to the 10 tribes is exactly what happened to Yeravam ben Nevat. What happened to Yeravam ben Nevat? What did he suffer because of this? Well, first of all, let's understand this. Yeravam ben Nevat was a Mashiach ben Yosef. He was more than a Mashiach ben Yosef. He was so close that you could almost taste it. The Yechida was already descending. It was descending so rapidly that it says that as soon as the Mashiach ben Yosef begins to actually become a Mashiach ben Yosef, then Yosef comes down. The Neshama of Yosef Atzadik comes down with Ephraim, and they begin to surround him and connect to the Mashiach ben Yosef. I mean, it's real fireworks over here. He has reached such a high level, Yeravam ben Nevat, that Yosef had already come down with Ephraim, so he was already connected. His Neshama was connected to very, very powerful forces. And suddenly decided to what? To do his thing. Suddenly decided to what? To start worshiping the idols. So what he did was, he damaged these other things. He damaged the very process of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Not only did he damage himself, but since he was so close, he damaged, in a certain way, or singed the Yechida. Like a slight singe, like a fire. You see. In other words, the kilkul, or the damage that he brought on his own neshama, affected very slightly the Yechida. That's how close he was. Now you may say, so what? What is, because of this, a terrible, terrible thing happens, and is supposed to happen. And let me describe to you what is supposed to happen because of this. Because that Yechida was slightly singed, it has to be purified again. It needs a tahara. You see. How does God purify that? Well, first of all, what happened is, as soon as he did the sin, his neshama, or the part of his neshama which allows him to be the Mashiach, jumped out of his body. It instantly separated from him. You see. So that he lost the full capacity to be a Mashiach. That's number one. His base neshama lost it. Now the Yechida had not actually come down yet. It still was above. You see. But it was descending, and it was slightly singed, and the quality of Mashiach ben Yosef, which rested in Yeravam, also jumped out, and it went into his son. And as soon as it went into his son became sick. And they tried to save his son, but his son died. And then the neshama went out, and it went away into a goy. And for 10 generations, the base neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef was in goyim. It left the Jewish people. It went to goyim. Which goyim, I don't know. I'm not clear which goyim it was. But obviously, whatever goy had it was obviously no usual or regular goy. This goy must have tremendous ruchnis to him in some way, because that neshama rested in a goy, and it did so for 10 generations. In a certain sense, that base neshama, called the shoresh, the root neshama, which was in Yeravam, which jumped out of himself, went into exile, and the exile that it went into was goyim. So here we see an interesting concept of the exile of a neshama, that sometimes a Jew can do such a sin where his neshama comes back as a goy. Now that's a true exile for neshama, because when a Jewish neshama comes back as a goy, that goy doesn't know he's Jewish, and that goy then goes to church or does whatever he does and so on. And that neshama suffers in great pain, you see. That's why when a neshama comes back as a goy, a Jewish neshama, and there are many Jewish neshamas out there in goyim, you see, and it lives in a goy, in the lifestyle of a goy, it suffers, and that suffering is its purification, is its tahara. That's how God purifies it. Now I believe, you see, that that's exactly what happened to the 10 tribes. That somehow all 10 tribes, those neshamas, I think, very possibly went into goyim, and that out there are thousands and thousands of goyim who possess the neshama of the original 10 tribes. And it will take the Mashiach at the end of time to go over and identify which goyim have those souls, and therefore which goyim really are Jews in their souls. That, I believe, is the golus of the 10 tribes. Exactly what happened to Yeravam. But we see a very important concept. The concept that a soul can go into exile by merely going into a goy, becoming part of a goy. You see. Many goyim who convert are really Jewish souls who went into them and then they're coming back. That's what conversion is most of the time. Conversion, essentially, when a goy converts, why does a goy convert? Why does a goy want to become Jewish? What, is he crazy? He wants to become what? With a people who have to deal with so many problems? He wants to become what? Part of a small minority? With a bunch of anti-Semites out there? He wants to take on 630 commandments when he can run around and do whatever he wants? Why does a goy in his right mind want to do that? Well, the truth of the matter is, in most of those cases, those converts, or those gerim, are really Jews. And they have the sensitivity to become a Jew because somehow they recognize that that's where they belong. I mean, I know one ger who's he's a very distinguished person. You could see a tremendous ruchnis in the person. He was a goy and he was brought up somewhere in the Midwest, and he went to Israel and was visiting. He stood in front of the wall for some reason, and somehow he felt something extraordinarily powerful, and he felt that for some reason he belonged to the Jew, and he converted, and you can see that he was an emes Jew. You can see because he has a real ruchnius in him. So you find this very kind of unusual situation. Now, this soul, therefore, Yeravam ben Nevat went to goyim for 10 generations. And it finally came back in a man, and this person who was the 10th generation, his name was Yosef. Okay? He was a guy before, I don't know his background, he converted and he became Jewish. And his name was Yosef. He had that neshama, so he was obviously no simple person. Okay? Now he had a son, and that son we all know. His son was Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. Rabbi Akiva was the son of a ger, or proselyte, and Rabbi Akiva had the neshama of Yeravam ben Nevat. That's why Rabbi Akiva was the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. But it took 10 generations for that thing to finally come back. The question here is that if Yeravam ben Nevat was so great, in the sense that he was the Mashiach ben Yosef and he was very close to the actual descent of the Yechidah, how can he fall for essentially a very, as someone said, a very crass kind of seduction, a very low-level seduction of really arrogance? And it's not a simple matter. We don't really understand, just like we can't understand what the Yetzer Hara was for Avodah Zarah. We don't understand why a person wanted to worship idols. We can't understand why did the Jews at that time want to set up a calf and in some way associate with this calf. What kind of feeling did they have? That they rather have some kind of observance with this calf than go to the Beis HaMikdash. It's very hard for us to understand this. Why? Because we no longer experience that kind of Yetzer Hara. We don't. The same thing with Yeravam ben Nevat. The best that we can understand now is that he fell in some way of arrogance. That's the best we can understand. But it wasn't that the Yetzer, the Satan came over and says, hey, don't stand for this in actuality, why should you be number two? I've oversimplified it to a large extent in that way. That obviously wasn't clearly what the Satan was trying to tell him. It was much deeper. The outcome of the entire thing was that he fell because of his arrogance. But what was the actual argument that the Satan went over to him to try and convince him? We're not clear. I'm not clear on. What exactly did the Satan say to him to convince him to defy, what was going on, or to deny what was going on? I'm not clear on that, and it's something that's very difficult for us to understand because we do not know. We can't even appreciate the mind, or the neshama of even a regular person who lived at that time. How are we going to understand the mind of Yeravam ben Nevat in terms of his type of Yetzer Hara? You have to remember what the Torah says about Yeravam ben Nevat was that he went out into the field with Achio Shiloni, it says there. And it says there that they discussed things which had never been known in the world. Yeravam ben Nevat was discussing things and saying things that no man had ever known. That's how deep he was and how great he was. And it's obvious, because anyone who begins to be connected to the Yechidah becomes aware of information, that literally has never been known. So, we cannot even begin to understand who he was. But, whatever it is, attached to that information was some possibility of a mistake. The Satan, and this is another point, whenever a person learns Torah, and he studies, his understanding of Torah is represented by a light that comes down. Okay? There's a certain light that descends from the Shekhinah. It descends down, and that's what fires up the neshama, and that's what gives the kedusha, or the depth of understanding of Torah. But what the Baruch Shem has permitted is that with every light that comes down that has to do with Torah, there's also a dark side to that light, or another side to that light where something is missing from that light. And because something is missing of that light, and that light is not perfect, it's kind of inadequate to some degree, it has the ability also to seduce and to give a person the wrong information or the wrong insight. That's the nature of the Yetzer Hara. In every kedusha, in every light, in every or that you can understand, there's also a part of that light which has the ability to create mistakes. Now why? Why does God want to create mistakes? Because what the Baruch Shem wants to do, is give you the choice of whether or not you want to find or you want to follow the light, the light, or the dark side of that light, the inadequate part of that light. He wants to allow you to choose between what aspect of that light you want. And you will choose depending on how you relate with God. If you can see yourself, if you are concerned with your own importance and with your own power and your own arrogance, then you will go after the part of the light which is missing, or the part of the light which is not complete. You see, and then that light will blind you into a truth that is not real. But if you want to submit to God and you want to relate to the Bnei Shem, then you will go after the light which is pure and which is correct and which is true. Because you want to serve the Bnei Shem, you want to become close to Him, you see. So it depends on what you want to do. Do you want to be free of God, or do you want to be connected to God? That's really where it's at. And depending on that, you will choose a kind of light which is consistent with what your objective is. Now, Yeravam ben Nevat had a light which never again descended. No man had that kind of a light. It was extraordinary, because it was a light almost as the light of Mashiach itself. But no matter how great that light was, until the Yechidah actually descended, that light has an imperfect, dark side to it. So he was dealing with extraordinary pure light. But even at that level, there was still a part of that which was what? Which was impure. And therefore that light itself was a test for Yeravam. And basically it was boiled down to what Yeravam wanted to really do. Did he want to be a king unto himself? Or do you want to be a king in the service of the King of Kings? But it's the light which he chose. Now, we do not understand what his Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov was. We don't understand the light that he had. So we can't understand what was the good side of the light and what was the imperfect side of it. It's impossible for us to know. You see, because that light is totally beyond us. To us, to people like us, that light would represent pure truth. But to a person who is privy to that light, there were aspects of that which can seduce him and which he can make mistakes. And that's what happened to Yeravam ben Nevat. And it was designed like that. Because again, the Bnei Shem wants us to bring the Mashiach totally by our efforts. And because of that, the Sultan has a right to attempt to what? To try us and to evaluate whether or not we really want the truth, or we want a truth that we construct. You see. And he has the right to do that. And the way that he does it is by tampering with the different levels of awe, or the different levels of truth. There are many, many levels of truth. Many, many levels of the depth of truth. Each of these levels has a good side and a bad side, has a complete side and an imperfect side. Each one of these levels, you see. So if there are, let's say, 100 different levels of truth, in each level there are two aspects to it. And each individual is always tested on each of these aspects. Now there's no difference with respect to that test to the lowest person who's tested on the first level of light, or the highest person who's at the 100th level. You see. Of course it's a difference in degree, but basically he still has that test. And that's what happened to Yeravam ben Nevat. It wasn't a crass, stupid thing that he did. Inserted, or part of the very light which made him who he was also the seeds of possible fall or possible destruction. And the Bnei Shem said, you have in front of you life and death, truth or falsity. You must choose. And he chose wrong. And not only he chose wrong, but all the Jews, the 10 tribes that lived with him, also did that. You see, they also fell, each one on their own, so that they lost the Messianic period themselves. You see. So it's not that simple. We today cannot begin to understand what that test was, or what Yeravam ben Nevat was grappling with. We don't know the truth that he was grappling with. We don't know, because our light is so much weaker. We can barely grapple with the light that we have, with the understanding that we have, you see. So we can't say that, but what we do know is that he was grappling with a very, very high light. But even though that light was so high, that truth was so high, it still contained within it imperfections. And those imperfections always constitute a potential hazard. You see. And it's that potential hazard in which Yeravam was obligated to sustain, which he did not. But that was his test, and that was the test of the 10 tribes. Now, what happened to the messianic process as a result? And this is it. Since that soul was damaged, since the base messianic soul of Yeravam ben Nevat was damaged, it had to be purified. So it went through 10 generations, and then it went back into Rabbi Akiva. But that really wasn't enough. You see, it really wasn't enough, because since it was damaged to a much larger degree, what would have to happen is something else. The Mashiach ben Yosef would have to die after he redeemed the Jews. That's really the damage that he done, and the purification that was required. If the damage that you do to a soul is great enough, there are many different ways to purify it. One of the greatest ways to purify it is basically that you as a Jew would have to die at the hands of another individual, you see, who possessed the Kedusha which you threw away. It's a triangular process. When a Jew does a sin, what happens is he throws away certain Kedusha that he should have acquired and he didn't. That Kedusha goes into the hands of another individual. That individual could be a goy, or that individual many times could be another Jew. And the way that Jew atones for what he did, for the damage, is that other person persecutes that Jew, and by persecuting him, slowly purifies that Jew as a victim and gives him back the Kedusha. This is what happened with the case of Yeravam and Nevat. He damaged his neshama, he damaged it in such a way where the Kedusha went into the lowest of the Jews, called the Yeravam. They are the lowest of the Jews. They're the Jews who are the greatest Rishonim in the Jewish nation, are the ones who are always trying to get Jews to stop learning and to stop being from. Those are all the Jews out there who will do everything possible to see to it that Jews hate the Torah and hate all forms of keeping the 613 commandments. These are called the Yeravam, and they're descended from the ancient Egyptians who converted at the time of Moshe, at the time when the Jews left Egypt. When the Jews left Egypt, there were many, many people, Egyptians, who also went along because they were very impressed with what they saw. They were called the Yeravam, or the mixed multitude. Okay? And they were Egyptians who were so impressed with what God had done for the Jews that they decided to convert. And they became Jews. And they became part of the Jewish nation. These were the Jews who were mainly responsible for the Egel Hazor, for the golden calf. You see. And it's these Jews also who were basically responsible and shared a great deal of what the difficulty was with Yeravam. So what would have to happen in the end was that this neshama of the Mashiach itself would have to submit to the Yeravam, which means that when Yeravam ben Nevat did his thing and damaged his soul, part of the Kedusha of the Mashiach itself went to the Yeravam. Now the only way to get it back was for the Mashiach ben Yosef to be in some way persecuted by this Yeravam. And that's exactly what has to happen. So what has to happen is that in the end of time, when the Mashiach ben Yosef appears and he redeems all the Jews, and he brings all the Jews out of all the nations of the world. You listening? He takes the Jews out of all the nations, out of Russia, out of South America, out of Africa, out of all the world, and he brings back all the Jews to what? To Eretz Yisrael, and they build the Beis HaMikdash, and suddenly the Jews really begin the redemption, but the Mashiach ben David has not yet arrived. It's still the period of Mashiach ben Yosef. But what happens is that suddenly the Yeravam will rebel against him, and the Mashiach ben Yosef will be killed in the war, you see, against the Yeravam. And this is after the redemption occurs. Can you imagine the misery of the Jews at that time? This is not before. This is after the redemption. After the Mashiach appears. The Mashiach ben Yosef will yet die. And the part of the Gula, that the redemption that he brought about, will again fail. Until the Mashiach ben David arrives. And what it says is that he will arrive and then destroy the Yeravam and everyone, and he will bring back the Mashiach ben Yosef back to life with Tchias HaMeishim. So the Mashiach ben Yosef will be the first one who experiences resurrection of the dead. And the one who will resurrect him is the Mashiach ben David. You see, that's the scenario. What I have described to you is what will happen or should happen in the end. The Mashiach ben Yosef will appear, he will declare himself as Mashiach, he will redeem all the Jews, he will make them all religious basically, right, all of them. He will gather all the Jews from all the countries of the world and bring them to Israel, and then at that moment, when all that was achieved, he will die at the hands of new Yeravam and new Goyim, and the redemption will be put on hold. And that will take place for a short while, and shortly thereafter the Mashiach ben David will suddenly appear, and he will completely destroy all the enemies of the Jews, and he will initiate the true Messianic period. Now this concept that the Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef rather, has to die, is only because of the damage of Yeravam and Nevat. Had Yeravam and Nevat not sinned, this never would have happened. Because why should the Mashiach ben Yosef die? That doesn't make some sense. The Mashiach ben Yosef represents the apex or the climax of the purification process. And once that purification process is done to all the Jews, then the redemption begins. You see? And then what happens? The Mashiach ben David then appears to finalize those things. And the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David work together as partners to complete the Gula. But that's all it is. Each one has a certain step in the process. And there is no step where the Mashiach ben Yosef should die. But the answer is that the reason why, and the Gemara says that he died, it's called the Misa of the Mashiach ben Yosef, is because of the sin of Yeravam and Nevat, because of the fact that Yeravam and Nevat, what he did, and because he was so close to being the Mashiach himself, he damaged the Messianic process to the extent that the Messianic process itself needs a Tahara. Not only does the Neshama of Yeravam and Nevat need a Tahara, not only does the Neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef need a Tahara, but the Neshama of the Messianic process, the process itself needs a purification. You see? And its purification lies in the fact that it will be vanquished by the Goyim and certain very evil Jews. And in that process, you see, the Kedusha will go back to the Mashiach ben Yosef, but only through the further deliverance of the Mashiach ben David. This is called the Gzeira, or the decree of the Misa of the Mashiach ben Yosef, or the death of Mashiach ben Yosef. And it's a horrible thing, because it means that after the Mashiach will have redeemed all the Jews, they will lose again. So I can't begin to tell you the depression and the anguish that the Jews will feel at that time. Now, good news. Yeah. Now the good news is that the decree on the death of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and therefore on the overturn or the regression of the Messianic process, apparently has been annulled. And I've seen it in a number of places that this has been annulled for several reasons. One of the reasons, or one of the ways that God has annulled the damage that was done to the Messianic process itself, through the sin of Yeravam and Nevat, and through the sin of the 10 tribes, you see, was the exile for the last 2,000 years. One of the reasons why the Jews are in exile for 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple is to erase the damage that was done by Yeravam and Nevat and his generation. Now you may say, well, why do we all have to suffer? Because the point is that we in some way are connected to that damage. Because all the souls that live today in some way are related to what happened to that point in time. You see. So the gulut, or the exile of the last 2,000 years, in essence erases the damage that was done by that primordial generation in the time of Yeravam and Nevat. So that's one reason why that decree has been annulled. Another reason is because Moshe Rabbeinu is also part of that annulment. The soul of Moshe Rabbeinu does not rest yet, but the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu is in a state of what's called a klipos, or in darkness, or in exile in the spiritual world itself. So that the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu, who is an extraordinarily powerful neshama, because he was a Mashiach ben Yosef, almost par excellence, he only missed this much from becoming it, and it wasn't his fault, it was because of the Jews. He has taken on a great deal of the brunt of the tahara, the purification, which is needed to avert that decree. You see. And every tzaddik who will not tell you this takes on part of that difficulty to avert the decree or the death of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now very few people know this. This whole concept of the death of Mashiach ben Yosef, why it's supposed to happen, you see, and how it's supposed to happen. You see, because this type of information is secluded only among the great tzaddikim in Klal Yisrael. The reason why we know about it is because the Ramchal saw fit to write about it. That's why. Normally, it is a deep, foreboding mystery that only great Kedoshim, who are Ruach Kodesh, and who are tremendously holy people know about. And many of them spend part of their lives doing that. I mean, I've once heard from a tzaddik, a very great tzaddik Kodesh, holy tzaddik who lives today, who said that he himself, through his own labors, has been able to remove a great deal of the damage done to this entire process, through his own avoda, you see. To his own avoda. So you find that the greatest Kabbalists and the greatest people are all involved in averting this decree, you see. Because the decree is an awesome, terrible decree. Because again, what does it mean? It means that after the full redemption takes place, suddenly there's a regression again. It goes back to what it was before, until the Mashiach ben David appears and then brings it back to where it should be. And that will be a terrible, terrible agony for the Jews. So the Baruch Hashem has saw fit to do all these things so that that decree would be annulled. And one of the reasons why we have been in exile for 2,000 years is to deal with the damage of the Messianic process itself. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, this information can be found in Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos, a sefer written by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And he wrote that book in order to explain why Shabtai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. And he writes in the book that what he's writing in this book, you are not allowed to write down. You're not even allowed to think about these things. That's what he wrote. He says, what I'm about to write down in this book is forbidden to write. It is even forbidden to think about. But he says, I must do it in order to rectify the damage that was done by Shabtai Tzvi. That's the only reason why we know what we know today. Now there's another reason also, is because shortly before the coming of the Mashiach, all those things which were totally unknown by the generations before are now opened up for the Jews, so that we can begin to understand all those things that have to do with the coming of the Mashiach. So therefore, we are now privy to information which is completely hidden from all the generations past. And that's why we are given to know these things now, and that's why he saw fit to reveal these things also. The interesting thing about the Sefer, which is called the Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos, as I mentioned, has never been translated, but there's another interesting thing also about it. We do not have the full Sefer yet. They found the first piece of the Sefer many, many years ago, and then they found many years ago, most of this was left out. They never knew it, they never had it. And the second part of the book was found, I think, maybe 10 years ago. That's it. It was found 10 years ago, right? And there's a third part of the book which is yet not found, and it's where the Ramchal gets into the really heavy stuff, and it's simply not available. Rabbi Chaim Friedlander, who put out a lot of others this film, published the second one, you see. And he says, in the end, he says, but from here, suddenly you will look at the Sefer and you'll see suddenly at some point it stops. Right in the middle, when the Ramchal starts to talk about all this really heavy stuff, when he starts getting to the literal personality of the Mashiach himself and begins to describe the thinking and the personality of the Mashiach, suddenly the book stops. And Rabbi Chaim Friedlander writes, Chaval al Da'ovdim, it is a tragic loss that we have, that just at this critical point we don't have it. But obviously, there's a hashgacha here. There's a hashgacha. There's another vein, there's a vein of this Sefer, another vein also on these, there's a Sefer that was found about 10 years ago. Okay? It was written by the Ramchal, and it is called Tak Tu Tfilis.
Are these translated?
No. Tak Tu Tfilis. Now, Tak Tu, if you count up the numbers, stands for 515. It's called Tak Tu Tfilis, or 515 prayers. Okay? Strange book. This book was discovered 10 years ago in manuscript. It was instantly recognized that the one who wrote it was Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. It was also discovered that this is the only manuscript in the world that was so hidden, nobody even knew that he even wrote this book. It was totally unknown among the bibliography of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto that he had written a book called Tak Tu Tfilis. Nobody even knew it until somebody saw that he had this manuscript and they didn't know what it was, and they looked at it and they saw that it was the sefer called Tatu Tfilis, written by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and apparently was passed down generation to generation in manuscript form. So it has never been published in 300 years. You see, or rather, almost 300 years, 280 years. It has never even been published, and it was finally published about 10 years ago. What is this sefer Tatu Tfilis that is so interesting? Well, it's 515 prayers, and the book is composed of 515 prayers. Why 515 prayers? These are 515 prayers that the Ramchal wrote to bring the Mashiach. They all start with Kein Echad Yochad Umiyuchad, God who is totally absolute one, you see, and it ends in Meshuach Kavisi Hashem. Each prayer ends in we hope for the ultimate redemption, and each one is a prayer to bring the ultimate redemption itself. Why 515? Because if you remember the Chumash, when Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to go into Israel, into the country of Israel, he started to daven to the Bonishim and beg the Bonishim to let him go in, and the Bonishim said no. And that begins the parsha V'eschanan. V'eschanan means, and Moshe says, V'eschanan, and I began to plead with God to let me into Israel. And the Bonishim says, no, you must be buried outside. You see, V'eschanan, the numerical value of V'eschanan is 515. Moshe davened 515 tefillas to bring to what? To go into Israel, because if he had gone into Israel, since he was a full-fledged Mashiach, he would have initiated the Messianic period. And the Bonishim says, no, you cannot go in because of the sin of the golden calf. You must die in the land of Moab, which is outside, symbolic of the fact that just like your body is outside of Israel, your neshama will be in the dark places, so that you can atone for the damage that was done on the golden calf. You see, that's why Moshe was never allowed to go in, because the Bonishim says, I cannot let you go into Israel because the Messianic period cannot arrive yet. And Moshe davened 515 tefillas. And what they say is that if Moshe, because the Bonishim says, enough, stop, enough. So it says if Moshe had davened one more tefillah, it's possible he would have been answered. And the Bonishim said, enough. So this 515 is obviously some kind of a magical number. So what the Ramchal did was to write an entire book of 500 prayers. You see, I don't know that the prayers of Moshe Rabbeinu, his own prayers, you see, and they are extraordinary. And the reason why the Ramchal can write it, because there's no question that the Ramchal himself was in his generation the Mashiach ben Yosef. And the way we know it, besides the fact that it's obvious, anyone who knows anything about Hashkafa, or what's called high Hashkafa, instantly can recognize that the Ramchal is the Mashiach ben Yosef, just in terms of what he was, and so on. But we find specifically, it said, because Eliyahu Navi appeared to him, it says there in one of the things, and he called him openly, Malka the Mashiach. He called him openly Mashiach. So the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was a classic case of a Mashiach who did not arrive. He had the potential, and he did tremendous things. He had tremendous things, but he could not arrive. But he was in a perfect position to understand why chapter 3 was a fourth Mashiach, and to write all these different tefillas. So we see this important concept, that a lot of information which nobody knew before, he wrote down for the first time and revealed it to us. Because it is the intention of the Rebbeinu Shalom for us to know these things. And I mentioned this, I believe, this last time or before that when I mentioned the story that Rav Shimon Yochai's student was in a cave and he saw this book, and suddenly a hand appeared of fire and took the book away, and the student of Rav Shimon Yochai who wrote the Zohar and came to him and says, what is this? Why is his hand take this book away? So he said, because obviously you came to a place that had to do with the ultimate redemption, and it is not for you to know. You see, but he said to him, I guarantee you this, that right before Mashiach does arrive, every child will know what you could not know. And that's what it is. You see, that's what it is. One of the signs of the fact that the Mashiach is coming is simply the fact that this form of the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is getting more and more popular. Now you may say that's strange. It's not strange, because that's exactly what was told to Moshe Chaim Luzzatto by Eliyahu Navi, and it's written in the letters. Yes, where Eliyahu Navi says that shortly before the ultimate redemption, with the light that was given to you will be spread out to all of Israel. You see, and what basically Eliyahu Navi told Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, he used to learn with him. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto learned with Eliyahu Navi since he was 18 years old. He was an 18-year-old kid sitting across the table learning b'chavrusa or in the companionship with Eliyahu Novi, which is an astounding thing. And what Eliyahu Novi said to him was that there's a special light that came down 3 times on the world. The first time it came down to Rav Shimon ben Yochai, and that light was the deepest mysteries of the Torah, and that was given over to Rav Shimon ben Yochai 2,000 years ago, and from that came the Zohar. The second time the light came down to Rav Yitzchak Luria, Isaac Luria, who was the Ari, the greatest Kabbalist at that time, and that came out as all the writings of the Ari, the Lurianic system of very deep Kabbalah and Hashkafa. And what Eliyahu Novi said is, there's a third time this light comes down, and this light will come down to you, and your light is greater than the other two. Why? The explanation to me is obvious. What it means is not that the light of Ramchal, or that Ramchal was bigger than the other two. That's not what it means. But it means that the light which came down to Rav Moshe Chaim's father was the purest. Because the other two, when they wrote in riddles and metaphors and analogs. But the Ramchal wrote openly. He didn't conceal what he wrote. He made it a little difficult to find it, that's true. But basically, he openly discussed the deepest things that were totally hidden and recessed from the greatest Jews of all time, totally. And he wrote down for the open. Why? Because Eliyahu Novi said that this information is required before the ultimate redemption. And before the ultimate redemption, one of the signs of the ultimate redemption is that your Torah and your Sform would suddenly become very well publicized. And we find, strange enough, that in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous popularity of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. His Derech Hashem was what? Was translated. His Das Tvunus was translated. And just a lot of stuff is going on with Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Of all his form, the only sefer that they learned of his was the Mesilas Yesharim, which is a sefer on how to work, how to become a tzaddik, how to work on avoda. Nobody ever learned the other form. Very few people learned it. For a long time. Until recently. So now all over Israel and all over America and all the yeshivas, they learn form from the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, you see. So suddenly he's gained an enormous popularity. But this is not a coincidence, you see. And there will even be greater popularity. And the fact is that these ideas that we discuss here will someday be known by everyone, clearly, you see. Because now is the time when this information is relevant. Hence now is the time when all of us really have to know it. When Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was put into Cherem, why is that? When Moshe Chaim Luzzatto came about 30 or 40 years after Shafat Tzvi. So there were many people, the leaders of Jewry at that time were very sensitive to would-be Kabbalists and so on. And he became very suspect. He was born in Padua, Italy, not far from Venice. And he was a very strange kid and so on. I mean, in the fact that he didn't have a beard, and I think at 18 years old, essentially he was unmarried, so he was a bocha. And at 18 years old, he was already learning with Eliyahu Novi, and there were malachim that used to come down to learn with him. He learned with Moshe Rabbeinu, with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. All kinds of neshamas came down to learn with him. And he was 18 years old. And he never told it to anyone, but he revealed it to his own Rebbe, Rabbi Shaya Bassam, who then and one of his other students, and he formed a small school of Kabbalists and people who devoted to this type of learning. But somehow one of his students let the word out about some of these things, and as soon as they got out, people started saying, who is this guy? Who is this 18-year-old kid that doesn't even have a beard, that's talking to Eliyahu Novi? And there were some very great leaders in the Jewish people that just couldn't handle this. They couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense to them. And there were some of them that were downright jealous. That's what it was. They were downright jealous. So what it was is they finally said, we don't want you to write any of these books. We don't want you to deal with these things and do things, because we're afraid you may be another Shafat Tzvi. And even though his Rebbe, the Rebbe of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Rabbi Shaya Bassam, was a very well-known Rebbe in Italy, rabbi, and he was known that he was a very, very good person, and he vouched for his student. But the fact is that he advised his student not to continue with the writings. So what he did was, and the agreement was made, was that what they did was they excommunicated him so that he would not be able to teach anymore. And in order to prevent from further, the Ramchal said, okay, to make shalom, what he did was he took most of his books and he put it into a chest and he sent it to Germany, to Frankfurt on Main, Germany, and it is buried there. in Frankfurt am Main. What are the books? There were books that are extraordinary, some that we do not have access to. One of them is a sefer of 1,000 pages. It is a commentary on Kohelet. On Kohelet, Ecclesiasticus. It's one of the Megillahs. You see, it is a commentary. But it's not the Ramchal's commentary. It is a commentary by the Malach who taught the Ramchal. You see. It's unknown. These things, it's buried somewhere. And there are loads of stuff that he wrote down. He wrote down another Zohar. It's called the Zohar Tinyana. Lost. He wrote down a complete book of Tehillim. He wrote his own book of Tehillim. Lost. There are many stuff which is totally lost. We have no access to. That who knows what are in these forms. Even the small bit that we have from them is so qualitatively superior or vastly superior than anything out there. We can imagine this other thing, but it's lost. It's buried somewhere in Frankfurt, Germany, and so on. And I'd like to. Is it possible to find it or not? I don't know. I've been speaking to some people who are very familiar with this kind of thing, because I've been involved in putting out a lot of the books of Moshe Ramasato. The last 3 books, my brother and I, we published under our auspices. The last 3 books that came out from him, and what do you call it? And somebody once mentioned one of the people who were involved in Eretz Yisrael. I was involved with Rabbi Chaim Friedlander, who was the one who actually put out the books, the manuscripts themselves, and so on. So we had been involved in putting out this form, and I was speaking to some of the other people about maybe the possibility of going to Frankfurt and trying to dig up some of the stuff. But I don't know. I mean, because you have to remember, it probably was buried in some shul in Frankfurt. But there's no shul anymore. It probably was destroyed years and years ago. So you'd have to find the old maps of Frankfurt, or whatever the story is, and whatever the situation
how far can we go?
What happened finally was he left Italy, and he went to Amsterdam. And it was in Amsterdam that he wrote the Mesilas Yesharim. He was a young guy. I mean, he was 24 years old, or whatever the story is. It's hard to believe a person of his stature, and he wrote the Mesilas Yesharim and a number of other performances on. And he was, in order to avoid getting into controversy, he was a lens grinder in Amsterdam, but he was very well received in Amsterdam. He had no problems there. And then from Amsterdam, he went to Eretz Yisrael, and he went to a city in Akko in Eretz Yisrael. And when he was in Akko, there was a plague there, I think a cholera plague, and he died. He, his wife, and his kids, they were all wiped out. And he was 40 years old. He's now there's an interesting thing. He is buried in Tveria, right next to Rabbi Akiva. And you went there, right? You can see the grave of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. It is right next to the grave of Rabbi Akiva. It's an awesome place for other reasons, because Rabbi Akiva was a Mashiach ben Yosef, and Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was a Mashiach ben Yosef. So it's an extraordinary place to be. This is no simple place over here. And not only that, apparently the thing, I don't know who said it, I don't know where, but what's commonly known about Ramchal, he died at 40 because he was the Gilgul, or the migration of the Neshama of Rabbi Akiva, who did not learn for the first 40 years. If you all remember, Rabbi Akiva began to learn at 40. That's when he got married and he started to learn. For 40 years, Rabbi Akiva was not involved. And that has to do with the period of the Mashiach ben Yosef, who's in a period of darkness. So what it says is that Neshama again returned for 40 years in Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. So that's why they're buried right next to each other. Very interesting. Now there seems to be some possibility that the grave of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, as it exists next to Rabbi Akiva, is not the true grave. I've heard that there are people who believe that he was buried in Akko, and there seems to be some kind of controversy of where the Ramchal was really buried. So some of these things are subject. So his life is a fascinating life, a very bizarre life in a way. He died as a very young man. He's only 4 years old when he died, and he achieved an enormous amount of Kedusha. I mean, at 18 years old, he was already in contact. In fact, he wrote a book, the letters, it's called the Igros Ramchal, or the letters of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and essentially it's the letters that he wrote to his Rebbe, and to other people, it's correspondences. And these letters are fascinating. One of the letters, he writes, I think, to his Rebbe, and he describes the first time that he got in contact with a Malach. And he describes how it happened. He was involved in saying certain kinds of what's called Yichudim, or certain Kabbalistic phrases and so on, and suddenly he was involved in, and suddenly he started to talk, and he heard a voice coming from his own lips that was not his own voice. And he realized that something was talking to him through him, so that he was having a conversation with himself. At first he would be somewhat, in a way, possessed, in a certain sense, or he would be conscious, and suddenly his vocal cords would be taken over by someone else, and it would say something, and then it would stop, and then he would talk back. And that's how he would learn with a malach, because you cannot see a malach, you see. So obviously the malach in some way would pair off with his own neshama and use the body of Rabbi Chaim Luzzatto to learn with it, one at a time. And it's fascinating how he describes this. I mean, it's extraordinary. First he said he didn't know what it was. He was shocked. But he describes to some extent his own experiences. But it's a fascinating thing. Now, people who read that, they couldn't believe it. You see, this letter is what got out. And there were a lot of people that couldn't believe, how can a person so young be zocher to this kind of information and this kind of experience? So there was enormous jealousy. And the truth is, the Ramchal would have been really forgotten. And the reason why he was not forgotten, basically, was for really several individuals. And from here you can begin to see who Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was. Because the greatest Gaon, the greatest mind in Lithuania in the last 500-600 years was the Vilna Gaon. I'm sure everyone heard of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was a gigantic mind, and they would say he knew 25,000 form in his head by heart. You see, an extraordinary mind. And he said that if Ramchal, this is the Vilna Gaon, who surpassed any and every party who ever lived within 400 years of him, within several hundred years. I mean, after him there was no one to match him. And even before there was no one to match him for hundreds of years. And some people said that there was no one to match the Vilna Gaon since the time of Nachmanides or Maimonides. That's how great the Vilna Gaon was. He was an astounding person. And he said that if Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Vilna Gaon was born, I believe, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was born in 1707 and died in 1747, and the Vilna Gaon was born, I think, in the 1720s. So the Vilna Gaon was a very young person with Ramchal, and they never met, you see. But the Vilna Gaon said, after Ramchal died, when he saw his book, had I known that this man was alive, and were able to go to him, he said, I would walk all the way from Vilna to Padua, Italy, to learn from this man. And the Vilna Gaon doesn't say this to anyone. Believe me, there is no one, because he was a total master himself. Okay, that's what he said. This is one statement that he was said about the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. The other statement that was said, and the Vilna Gaon, of course, was the greatest of the Litvish Goyim. Now, what about the Hasidim? What do they say about Moshe Chaim Luzzatto? Well, the Mezritcher Magid, who was the greatest student of the Baal Shem Tov, said that the generation of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto were totally unworthy of understanding who he was, his neshama, you see. That's what the Mezmagid, who was a chassid, said. And probably the greatest tribute that I ever heard paid to Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was the following. And it comes from the Hasidim. I remember where I saw this, but it is astounding. There are 3 parts to the soul. Well, there are 5 parts, but there are 3 basic parts. The lowest part is called the nefesh. The nefesh. The next part is called the ruach, and the highest part is called the neshama. Okay? Now, at the time in the 18th century, in the 1700s, there were 2 outstanding individuals. One was the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of Hasidus, who was in a tremendous neshama. The other one was another individual who lived in Israel. His name was Chaim Ibn Otta, or the Or Chaim. He's on the Chumash, the Or Chaim, who's a tremendous tzaddik, outstanding tzaddik, you see. And with the Hasidim, they consider the Baal Shem Tov as the greatest neshama on, and the Baal Shem Tov lives at the same time as the Vilna Gaon. So the Baal Shem Tov was the greatest of the Hasidic Rebbe's. He was the founder of Hasidic Rebbe's. But the only other person that the Hasidim also revere is the Or Chaim, or Chaim Ibn Otta. He was a Sephardi. They revere him also greatly. And what they say is the following: that the Baal Shem Tov had the nefesh of the Mashiach. That's who he was. He had the nefesh part of the Mashiach. Reb Chaim Ibn Otta had the ruach part. You see, that's why they say that if the Baal Shem Tov would have gotten together with Reb Chaim Ibn Otta, then they would have forced the Geula. Now, who had the third part? The Hasidim say Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto had the neshama of the Mashiach itself. So you see what the Hasidim say on Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto and what the Litvish say on him. And can you dispute that? That both groups hold what a giant Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was, you see. So this is the thing. And Nevat, he had a very difficult life. But wait, what's the hashkafa here? We can understand what happened to Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Remember, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was a Mashiach who could not arrive. and who had to give the world a certain light. But since the Jews are not worthy, you see, of his arrival, you see, right? What happens is that the Messianic light many times has to go into darkness, and he had to go into darkness. Because in other words, the Ramchal had to pay the price for the inadequacy of his generation to bring down the Messianic light. So he had to be put in Cherem and excommunication. But what the Jews did was put their own Mashiach into Cherem. That's in effect what they did, which is astounding. Had the Jews known at that time that they excommunicated their own Mashiach, I mean, what would have happened? They would have had strokes. But that's essentially what they did. But that's what had to be. Because since the Jews were not worthy, the Bnei Hashem had to hide the Messianic light. And we discussed, how do you hide the Messianic light? One way to hide it is to see to it that the Jews don't recognize it and deny it and put it into excommunication. So if the Jews are excommunicating this Moshe Rabbeinu, is there something going to run after him? The Sultan's not going to be concerned with someone that the Jews themselves are excommunicating. So this is the way the Bnei Hashem hid Moshe Chaim Lutzaro. He hid him. But the light of Moshe Chaim Lutzaro is the beginning of the light of the Mashiach. Because that's his chelik, what Eliyahu Hanavi told him. That it is your light, ultimately, which will bring the redemption. Because your light is from that light, which ultimately is the light of the Mashiach itself. And you see that all the people later on recognize that. The Vilna Gaon once, he kept many of the books of Moshe Chaim Lutzaro, and there's one book that he got it manuscript, it's called Adib Amorim, and it's a commentary on one of the Idul Rabbah, which is one of the sections of the Zohar, and it's a very difficult section, and he got this Pirush, he got the commentary of Moshe Chaim Lutzaro manuscript, and it says, on the day that he opened up this manuscript, and he saw it was, he took off his regular clothes, it was a weekday, and he put on his Yontif clothes, to celebrate the fact of what this book was. So you see again and again who Rav Moshe Chaim Lutzaro was.